thank you for joining us for another episode of God, Law, and Liberty with David Fowler, President of the Family Action Council of Tennessee. Every week, we are putting culture, politics, and law on a collision course with the truth of God's Word. And now, here's David.
Welcome to this week's episode of God, Law, and Liberty. I'm delighted to have you with me, and I look forward to our examination today of the Donald Trump situation and the rule of law. But before I get into our topic, I want to again briefly announce that if you are between the ages of 14 and 18 or the parent of a child between those ages, the Ezra Institute is holding a week-long worldview camp in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, just a little north of Knoxville, on July 12th through the 18th. And there's information and registration at the EzraInstitute.com website. And I believe, if I recall correctly, you can even get an hour's worth of credit, college credit, if you're attending Bryan College, and there may be a discount even on tuition for those who attend the Worldview Camp that go to Bryan College. So hope you'll check that out at the EzraInstitute.com. So today, as I've already indicated, I want to take as my jumping off point some of what I've been reading following the prosecution and conviction of Donald Trump, particularly comments about the rule of law. And what I've read is numerous comments by Christians and conservatives about the rule of law and this whole thing being a violation of the rule of law. On the other hand, those on the other side of this conviction see it as a vindication of the rule of law, saying it proves that no person is above the law and is immune from obedience and compliance to the law. So what if I were to tell you that I think few on either side of those comments know what they're talking about, especially perhaps the Christians and conservatives? Of course, I'm saying that generally, I'm not saying that's true of everybody who's issued a comment about the rule of law in connection with this matter, but a lot of what I've seen coming from Christians indicates that, well, they probably could benefit from today's episode. So, while I'm mentioning that, if you have some friends who are concerned about the rule of law and what it means and what's its status in our country, then let me encourage you to share this episode with them. And I would tell you this, it's not that liberals are correct in their comments, but their comments about no one being above prosecution, according to the law, is closer to the truth than some of the other stuff that I hear out there. Now, this idea about nobody being above the law and immune from prosecution, to be honest, it's just a shibboleth of American politics that's detached from a real and true understanding of what the rule of law is. In fact, I would tell you that in principle, the rule of law has been banished from American jurisprudence for almost 90 years. And for sure, America's law schools, its leading law schools, began banishing the predicate for the rule of law before then, in the late 1800s. It actually began in Harvard in the late 1800s, and its banishment of the predicate for the rule of law was officially embraced by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1938, when at the same time it banished the historic and true understanding of common law from our jurisprudence. So today we're going to take a look at the history of the rule of law in the Western legal tradition. And you tell me if you think it can even exist today. Now, I'm going to let you in on a secret. That's a trick question. Maybe I'll let you chew on it for a week or two, figure out why. But if any of you are interested in thinking through this beyond what I covered today, would you let me know by email to info@factn.org. That's info at factn.org, because I'm thinking of hosting a 1-hour Zoom call in the next week or two for any who want to chew on this a bit further and bat it around. It'd probably be around noon Central Time, just in case that matters to you, because I want to accommodate those who are out towards the West Coast. But if you're interested in maybe something like that, send me an email to info@factn.org. Again, info@factn.org. So where I want to start today on the rule of law is by mentioning a book called Lex Rex by Samuel Rutherford. Some of you may know of the book, and some of you may have read it, and I'm not really going to discuss it today. But I bring it up because it was highly influential among the Westminster divines who gave us the Westminster Confession. And I bring that up because this goes to the thesis I offered, maybe I think it was last week, that kings and rulers, our elected officials, need to first be good theologians. And the reason this pertains to my thesis, and many of you may know this, but the Westminster divines were called together by an act of Parliament to provide clarity for them on matters of the gospel and the relationship of the gospel to the governing of the nation. So we might say that the Westminster Confession, along with the two catechisms the divines produced, were like discipleship materials for the members of parliaments. Now, let me just ask you, can you imagine your governor and members of your state legislature, the members of Congress, studying the Westminster Confession as an aid to their public service? In fact, I suspect a lot of folks who call themselves Presbyterians, or probably better, Calvinists, and even Reformed Baptists, have not even read it. I'm not saying the ministers, but the person in the pew, let alone have those folks given it serious and substantial consideration or study. Again, not referring to the ministers. If you came out of a Presbyterian seminary, maybe a Reformed Baptist seminary, you would have studied it. But I do wonder how many of them, especially politicians, have read it in relation to how public officials should serve as ministers unto God in elected office. In fact, what's interesting to me, among some of the persons in the Presbyterian church I know, they don't want to talk about the politics or law or civil government, but they're sure happy to talk about the Westminster Confession. So they've even detached it from the historical predicate for the divines even being called together. And I'm not picking on Presbyterian ministers or Calvinistic ministers and elders, but that is their heritage and their inheritance from those who came before them. And at least in my experience, and it's not universal, okay, I'm getting it, but few that I know enough about law and civil government to leave that knowledge as an inheritance to others. And the same would be true of every other denomination, some of which eschew politics completely, right? So they can't even leave a heritage, an inheritance to the future generations about law and government and politics. So anyway, I'll move on. But the sub-pagan law schools of our day, which is most of them, would never want a group of law students to read and think deeply about Rutherford's book. And I suspect it's not read in many Christian law schools either. And also, I bet that the Conference of State Legislators that I'm familiar with, that many state legislators belong to, that get materials from, I don't think they'd want legislators reading Lex Rex either. And that's because, by the very title of the book, Lex, meaning law, and Rex, meaning king, and by putting Lex in front of Rex, the book itself is an assertion by Rutherford that God's law is king. Lex was always to precede Rex. Now, no doubt there'd be some today who would say, well, we exalt the primacy of the law as well. Of course, they have a different understanding of what law is, but they would say that. And they would say that their exaltation of the primacy of the law is reflected in their saying Donald Trump's not above prosecution and conviction. But again, as I said, they do that with a wrong understanding of what the nature of law itself is. But Lex Rex was built upon or supplemented or added to the work of Lord Henry deBracton in the 13th century. And that's who I want to talk about a little bit today. Bracton, as he's most often called, or Lord Bracton, is sometimes called the father of the common law. And as you know, the common law of England became the foundation. We carried over that conception of law and such of it as fit our historical circumstances. And the century in which Bracton was writing is the same century in which the Magna Carta was signed. And the grounds for and the formulation of that document provided the foundation for what today we call constitutional governance. So our history needs to at least go back that far in our understanding of law and the rule of law. Anyway, this is what Bracton wrote about the relationship between law and the ruler, the king. Now, keep in mind that this office of king was critical at that time because he was writing before parliamentary supremacy was established following the English Revolution. Okay, so the king was, the lawmaker, so to speak. And here's what Bracton wrote: "Nothing is more fitting for a sovereign than to live by the laws, nor is there any greater sovereignty than to govern according to law. And he ought properly to yield to the law what the law has bestowed upon him, for the law makes him king." Let me read that again. "Nothing is more fitting for a sovereign than to live by the laws, nor is there any greater sovereignty than to govern according to law. And he," referring to the king, "ought properly to yield to the law what the law has bestowed upon him, for the law makes him king." In other words, there's a law outside of the king and independent of the king that informs the king's authority. But notice something else here that for a long time I didn't pick up on, or I didn't appreciate, let's put it that way. The law makes him king. In other words, it's not just that there's simply a positive law about the qualifications for king, like we have for certain offices in our state and federal governments. And it's not simply that there's a law or laws that describe what authority and powers the kings have. We have that too, right? The Tennessee Constitution says that the king has, or the governor has executive powers, and he can't exercise legislative or judicial powers, right? The separation of powers. You see, we would say that the rule of law means that if the public official breaks the law pertaining to his office, or breaks other laws applicable to every citizen, then he can be removed from office if that's permitted by the positive laws. Or, in the case of criminal laws, he can be prosecuted and convicted, like Trump, or perhaps coming soon to Hunter Biden, a conviction, right? Now, you see, Bracton is saying something else, or I should say something more than there's a law outside the king that the king should acknowledge. He says the law makes the king. Now, what could he have possibly meant by that? And I think I'll leave you to chew on that question or perhaps take it up on the Zoom call for those of you who are interested. But there's something else important in Bracton's conception of law. But before I get to that, you may have noted earlier I used the word sub-pagan instead of pagan in referring to law schools, and I want to explain what I mean by that, because I'm going to use it in this next little bit that follows. I used the term sub-pagan because, as Kuyper said back in 1898, our diseased organism is less receptive to the cure for its condition than was the pagan Greco-Roman world. And of course, that's even more true today. You see, those societies still believed in gods, or we might at least say beings greater than themselves, and they were searching for meaning and purpose, for an ultimate reality, what we would call metaphysics, which is a pursuit and a concept that we've abandoned. Scientists actually have a positive aversion to metaphysics. And the philosophers have said the only meaning and purpose to be had for this concatenation of atoms and energy is what we supply. And to be honest, most of the Christians that I know in my field tend to frame their arguments that way because that's the arguments that they're looking for, right? So it's as if we need to see almost a rise of paganistic thought again before any argument resting on metaphysics will resonate. At least not if we don't force a conversation on metaphysics. So let me give you an example of what I'm saying here. Simply saying that marriage is a man and a woman means nothing today. Saying that's what marriage has historically meant means nothing today. It's a question of meaning, right? And it won't matter even if we try to define marriage in terms of sexual complementariness, because there's no reason why that should define its meaning unless there's something else to what a marital relationship is other than just two people. And that's why Christians haven't won the debate, making this argument about the history and the historical understanding of marriage or the complementariness of women. And I think it's why they don't even debate it anymore with anyone outside the institutional church. Trying to find folks within the Christian community or the ministry that want to talk about the public meaning of marriage, well, it's almost impossible. I mean, that conversation's dead. And perhaps it's because we don't know how to breathe life in it by the wisdom and truth that Christ is to us and in us. So, with that explanation of why I talk about sub-pagan, let me continue with our look here at the rule of law to say this. To sub-pagan moderns with an evolutionary cosmology, not only is a law that makes a king, apart from civil enactments, laws of parliament or statutes of legislative bodies, not credible or intelligible, its possibility would be terrifying. They couldn't help but see such a law as anything less than a God-based system for tyranny, and a tyranny that could be used to justify about anything. Because whatever law is that comes from the king or the legislature, it's from God. And objections can be just swept away with, well, God told me to enact that particular law. So sub-pagans would say the espousal of this idea of Bracton just gives the ruler a license to do evil in the name of God and subjugate everybody to the supposed will of God. So how do you answer that if you're a Christian? I mean, isn't that what we hear when card-carrying, self-identifying theonomists show up in political and legal debates? And isn't it why many Christians even are alarmed about the rise of theonomic thinking? I've I mean, I've heard it from Christian lawyers when I've spoken about Bracton and Blackstone. And the question has to be this, that we're going to have to figure out a good answer to. What is to hold in check, or hold things in check, if theonomists get control of the levers of power under the conception of civil government and law we now have? I mean, I believe there'd be any number of Christians who'd be petrified of the idea that a person like Lucius Rushdoony would be made king of America. And some of those who treat Rushdoony as a final authority on all matters of law and civil government, they'd be petrified if I was made king. I mean, I even heard from some people who were horrified that I didn't know it would be a wise and prudent thing in this time to impose the death penalty on a woman for having an abortion. I mean, they'd be petrified, right? Not to mention folks like Tim Keller or David French. But the question is, you can just say, you know, I don't want to listen to you anymore. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't want to read anything else you've written before. But the fact is, how do you think through those questions? What answers those kinds of questions? What would have to take place for the Christian community to take control of the levers of power and not have the majority of Americans scared to death of what would happen to them? Personally, I think these are important questions, and I don't find many Christians thinking about answers to them, let alone leaders in our pulpits and the leaders of legal and policy organizations, and thinking about what effect those answers would have on what we preach and what we do in politics and law. Some of the theonomists think they got it all down because they know what the right law should be, but they don't know how to respond to these kinds of questions other than, well, God said so. And that's exactly what scares them to death. Sends them running. They don't want anything to do with that kind of gospel, right? Now, I'm not an antinomian here. But I'm just saying, as I said the other week, I think quoting David Shannon on Chalk Knox, some of the folks coming into the conversation late here, and they're frankly messing things up. They don't have answers for any of these things. They haven't thought through them deeply enough. And if you'd like to know what Bracton said about some of these questions, how he answered some of these, and folks like Matthew Hale, well, and how I've begun to think about him, maybe it'd be one of those people that want to join me for the Zoom call for about an hour, sometime in the next week or so. And I'd like to keep it to 4 or 5 folks so we can help each other with what we're thinking, have a little interaction. So the first ones to say they're interested in it are the ones I'll follow up with about finding a mutually agreeable time and place. So again, if that's of interest to you, send me an email at factn.org. factn.org. And I'll get back to you. But anyway, that's it for today. And again, if you know some folks who might want to chew on the questions I've raised, I hope you'll share this episode with them. But until then, well, till next week, so long, everybody. And look forward to being back with you next week.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. God, Law, and Liberty is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. For more information, please visit us at www.facttennessee.org. That's factennessee.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Fact Tennessee.